I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm Molly Barrows. As an investigative journalist, telling the truth has always been important to me. It is the path to justice, but not everyone wants to hear it. I tell the stories of victims and their families who often feel invisible.
Hi, I'm Pam Hill. My sister was savagely murdered, and the trauma from that tragedy nearly killed me. I speak up for victims because I know what it feels like to be invisible.
I've been working with Pam for the past several years, researching and reporting on the brutal death of her sister, Sharon Aydelott. This is the second episode in a two-part series where we break down her sister's case, and we want to warn you some of this information is indeed very graphic. Sharon Hill Aydelott was a popular middle school science teacher, violently killed in her own home by her teenage son on Christmas Eve, 2013, in the small, well-to-do community of Gulf Breeze in Florida. Now, this savage slaying made headlines all over the world when it happened. Brandon Aydelott, 17 years old at the time, honor roll student, star baseball player, he confessed to stabbing his mother with multiple knives, breaking some off even in her skull and eye socket. He also beat her with his favorite baseball bat. The autopsy found where there were imprints from his Van shoes on her face. So this was a brutal killing. And again, an honor roll student and an athlete. Up until that point, he claimed voices told him to kill his 48-year-old mother. He was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, found not guilty by reason of insanity. And since then, Brandon Aydelott has been in the custody of the Florida Department of Children and Families and confined to Florida State Hospital for the criminally insane in Chattahoochee, Florida. Now, state psychologists say they're almost ready to recommend him for conditional release back into the community. And that is the last thing that you want. Isn't that the case, Pam?
That's the last thing. We were promised that he would never get out. And this was something not guilty by reason of insanity that never really sat well with me because he is guilty. He admitted to it in court. The judge reiterated that he did kill his mother. That was a fact that's not disputed. And now here he is. If we were promised, which we were, that he would never get out, then I could go along with that. But now here we are. And they're trying to let him out to come live back in our neighborhood.
Right. And the truth of the matter is that was never a promise they could have made to begin with because Florida, like most states, doesn't have the option for guilty by reason of insanity. Right. So once you're found not guilty, you're technically not guilty of the crime. So once they think you're mentally competent to take care of yourself or no longer meet the criteria for being held in those facilities, then you are basically free to go out into the community at various levels. This would be into a halfway house of sorts. A group home.
And that's why I wished they had never said that to us. That is a promise when someone tells you, he'll never get out. He killed his mother, for God's sake. I mean, what would a normal person... We're regular, normal folks. We don't know the judicial system, but that is why I have made myself learn it. I have determined I'm a pharmacist by trade. I've educated as a pharmacist, but I have appointed myself as a victim's advocate because I will yell and raise hell. I don't want anybody else to go through what my family's gone through.
That's right. Now, you and I were at this latest hearing because he is evaluated every 6 months. The state updates the court on his mental condition and whether or not he still meets the criteria to be held. This was in September of 22 was his most recent hearing. And the state psychologist said that they suspected he would be ready for conditional release by spring of 2023. So you guys are adamantly opposed to this, in part because you saw what was happening in Brandon's life and Sharon's life in the weeks and months leading up to this crime. I think for those who aren't familiar with the family, they just see the headlines. They just caught a little bit about the case here and there if they've heard of it before. And there's this feeling of it just sort of happened in an isolated incident that he just snapped one day. But it wasn't that simple. There was a lot that was going on. There were warning signs.
Mhm.
Sharon Aydelott, his mother, was trying to get him help, but she really wasn't getting the support from her ex-husband, his father, in order to get him the kind of help that he needed.
Right.
And in fact, Sharon and her ex-husband, who Brandon was living with at the time, did not see eye to eye. Bring us up to speed a little bit about what was going on with Brandon in those weeks and months before he killed his mom.
He had been living with Sharon, and then when he decided he wanted to, and he was a good boy, when he wanted to stay out late, go drinking, we found that he was selling Mango Kush and using Mango Kush, which is spice, which is a synthetic marijuana. I mean, he's a privileged child. He had no reason to even be selling drugs. He shouldn't have been using drugs either, but, selling drugs. I mean, all his needs were always met.
And the reason he told you is because he wanted to save money on what he was spending on drugs to party.
Right. And it was in his friend group, in his community, that marched from across the street over into Sharon's house.
Yes.
Sharon was a single mom at home, taking care of Brandon and Biz. And Brandon was big then. He's 6'2", 195 pounds.
Fit, worked out all the time.
A jock. He would bear down on her, and she would kind of push him off a little bit. He's her kid. She doesn't want to hurt him. I mean, she couldn't have. But he just started being aggressive, when before he hadn't been. But then he started sneaking out of the house, leaving the windows and doors open, with Sharon and Biz laying in the house like little lambs, because he was so high, he couldn't remember what he was doing.
Right.
So he had to take me to work one day. He took me to the wrong corporation. I worked for one big box pharmacy, and he took me to the other one.
Unbelievable.
And then he tried to drag the stool, the high back stool from the breakfast nook with us too. And he didn't even realize he was doing that. So I let him take me to work. And at that moment I had Biz with me too, and I wouldn't let him take her.
And that was in the fall of 2013, around the time that he moved out of his mom's house.
Right.
In with his dad.
Right. And he started being very disrespectful. And when his dad let him do whatever he wanted to, he had to follow rules at Sharon's house. She loved him enough to discipline him.
Yes. She found those drugs in his closet. That was the beginning of the great rift between them, if we'd even call it a rift. Right. It was more that she was a concerned mom. She didn't want him exposed to the drugs, didn't want to put his future in jeopardy, didn't want her daughter, 10-year-old Elizabeth, who was, just 10 at the time, to be exposed to that sort of behavior, not to mention how he was acting so bizarrely. So initially, you guys thought it was more just that drugs was affecting his personality. There was certainly no indication that you thought that he had something as serious as schizophrenia.
No, but I knew his behavior, being a pharmacist, I knew his behavior was elevated from, I guess, what would be normal recreational drug use.
Let's talk about Brandon for a minute so that people can understand the difference in the way that he was and the behavior that he was exhibiting in the weeks and months before he killed his mom, just so they understand the stark difference. What was Brandon and Sharon both like? What were they both like? What was Brandon like as a little boy? What was Sharon like as a mother?
Sharon was the sweetest, softest, she was so fun. She was just like the sunshine. And she loved her family. She loved our big family, and she loved her little family. Brandon and Biz were her life. I mean, just her joy. And Brandon was such a sweet little boy. He loved church. He loved our family. He always wanted to make good decisions. He was honorable. He wanted to do the right thing. And he was kind and sweet and strong, and even a little bit shy. Sharon kind of referred to him one time as Prince Charming.
Yes. And her principal and friend, who she worked with for years at the school that she worked at for 15 years, Holly Navarre Middle School, said that Brandon was the kind of boy, because she said she grew up knowing him. She said he's the kind of girl you'd want to marry, a boy you'd want to marry your daughter. That he was, talked like a preacher, could quote Bible scripture, was polite, was well-mannered, was doing well in school, seemed smart. So it seemed like he had everything going for him. And then Sharon, that's all she ever wanted to be, was a mommy to a certain extent. As she was also a smart business person. She had helped your dad with his business. It was you, your mom, your sister Patricia, and Sharon was the baby growing up between Birmingham and Pensacola. Your parents had split when you were young, and your dad had a successful business in Pensacola. So you guys were exposed to great social circles. He had a good family, both in Birmingham and Pensacola. On his mom's side of the family, not quite as close, it sounds like, with family from his dad's side, but it was because mostly they lived in Alabama. They were a little more spread out, it sounded like.
Right. And his grandparents on his dad's side passed away earlier in life. And they loved him. They loved Brandon so much. Everybody loved Brandon. He was our joy, just like all the children in our family. My family loves children and we love each other. That's why this is so just bizarre to me. It's just so bizarre. And Sharon was the kind of person that you just wanted to be in the same room with her.
Right. And you and I have been working on this story for a number of years. I've interviewed her coworkers. I've interviewed other family members. I've interviewed her friends. She was a sorority member in college. I've talked to her sorority sisters. And to a T, she was well-liked. She was well-loved. She's described as smart. Like you said, the sunshine, the smile that lights up the room, very positive, committed to her relationships, at nurturing her friendships. Every one of the teachers that I spoke to that worked with her, including her principal, former students, they just loved her. She made a big impact. And her kids, by all accounts, were crazy about her as well. I think that's probably why it must have been so shocking to you that even though he had this bad behavior that seemed to spiral downward in the months before he so brutally killed her, there was no indication that something that horrible was on the horizon.
Right. Well, the talk that Brandon was talking was talk we've heard before. You know, it was just mimicking what he'd heard his dad say, you know, little words like that or that kind of, Sharon didn't talk bad about Randy in front of her children. And apparently Brandon, he was perceiving anything that Sharon did to correct him as her taking him on instead of being corrective or what a disciplined parent would do. You know, he took it as, oh, you're taking me on now. And basically at one point he told her, you've run every man out of this house, you know, because Sharon divorced Randy, but Brandon was a teenager still. But you don't talk to your parents like that. He wasn't brought up like that. That stuff, he's just repeating some trash talk that he's heard at other places.
Yes, and let me bring our audience up to speed. So the Aydelott family, Sharon and Randy Aydelott, actually split in 2010 after Randy Aydelott was fired from his coaching and teaching job at Pensacola High School. He was having an inappropriate relationship with a 14-year-old girl in his science class. According to investigative records, and I've pulled a lot, they exchanged hundreds of texts and calls, many sexual. The incident was traumatic for the entire family. According to court documents, Randy Aydelott was upset he had been caught and lost his job over this incident. And he was angry with Sharon because she was outraged and refused to make excuses for his scandalous behavior. And it's interesting to me that, you know, the story of how those texts were discovered is a story in and of itself. And you can hear that story, which Pam and I will break down in another episode on my podcast, Gulf Coast Confidential, in a segment called Confessions in the Field House. So there was just this circle of protection that Randy Aydelott seemed to have from his principal and other coaches that wanted to protect him from the consequences of this inappropriate relationship. It was like, oh, heck, he made a mistake, but he shouldn't have to lose his job over it, even though he did. And he wanted Sharon to carry that same water, and she refused. And so he had a meltdown. He was on the floor crying, according to a domestic violence injunction transcript of a court hearing that Sharon requested a DVI against him because of this meltdown that he had in their home after he was caught. She was talking to him about what had happened, and he couldn't accept responsibility. And he kept saying, what I did wasn't criminal. And he was not criminally charged. But again, there is far more to why he was not criminally charged than we're going to get into this incident. But his meltdown, he was punching holes in the sheetrock wall of his closet, of his walk-in closet. Then he was on the floor, hitting his head into the wall. He was grabbing a gun, even though it was in a case, and implying to Sharon that he was going to do something with it. And she wasn't sure if he was going to use it on himself or their family. So she became scared. And that's when she requested the DVI, and the court did grant it for a year. So much trauma, so much drama going on in this family. What kind of an impact did all of that have on the family? Because Randy did file for divorce and move out within days of this incident breaking.
Mm-hmm. After the initial fracas or the flare-up, they kind of settled into a routine. But at one point, Brandon was losing weight, sad and crying all the time, hiding in his bedroom, got so upset and angry with Randy and so embarrassed that he had so much acid coming back from his stomach, it burned his esophagus and he had to have surgery. But eventually, they settled into their little routine, the three of them, school, after school activities and all the sports and dance and family events. They just kind of settled back in.
Yeah, Biz was into dance and karate. Brandon was a very good athlete. And Sharon made sure to get him back involved in sports because she knew that that was something that he enjoyed. And her family was definitely her priority. She got custody of the kids in the divorce. She got the house. Randy fought to get his job back. He lost that petition. So he continued to struggle as financially because he didn't have the same type of job that he had before. He was getting by on odd jobs. So there was this widening gap between lifestyles that Randy was now leading. He was living off and on with his sister. Sharon was trying to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. And that's one thing that I thought was so interesting talking to her friends and other family members, including yourself, is that how little that she really talked about what happened with Randy in the community. So I think to a certain extent, even though it did make the news that Randy had been fired and busted for trying to have this inappropriate relationship with a 14-year-old girl, for some people were shocked and horrified. Sharon didn't talk about it a lot because she didn't want that blowback on her kids. She didn't want them to be embarrassed or associated directly and feel that stress of people being ashamed, of feeling ashamed of what their father had done. She tried to protect them from that, it sounds like.
Because they had remedied it. He was over there, she's over here. And Sharon wasn't that kind of person. She wasn't the kind of person to run you down. She believed that the only person she could change is herself. And she worked on herself. I mean, she worked on herself all the time.
She went to counseling. She'd even gone to counseling with Randy before he left.
She did. She'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to drive across town to be at a counselor at 6. And she would like us to write affirmations on her mirror. She thought good thoughts. She read good books. She loved Joel Osteen. She loved the Lord. She loved being at church. She stayed in what most of us should stay in, that happy, joyous situation. I mean, she couldn't change Randy. She did everything she could that she was supposed to do, but she didn't wallow around in it. And she just didn't talk to other people about that unless it was someone very, very close.
Exactly. Well, according to Brandon, everything was pretty normal until he started to do drugs around his sophomore and junior year. And it came with, he said, other athletes were also at least smoking marijuana and drinking heavily at parties. And he became known as that guy that just got wasted, that just drank until he blacked out. And then that behavior seemed to build, and statements that he made to you in Chattahoochee along the lines of, that's why he started selling drugs basically with another friend, another athlete, because they wanted to cut down on the amount of money that they were spending on their party bills, if you will. He thought that would help make him some money.
He would. And it just breaks my heart because he had a car. He had everything he wanted. His mom paid for his gas, or my dad would. He didn't have to want for anything. But here he is again, just being disobedient and going to have it his way.
Yes. And that was something I thought was revealing too, when he was adamant that his dad did not talk badly about his mother, especially during the time when he moved in with him, because that is something that I think was a very interesting conversation that you had. What was your dad saying about your mom during that time? What was going through your head, basically, that these voices were so adamant about killing your mom? And he was insistent that his dad didn't talk bad about her. But when asked if your dad did talk bad about her, what would he say? And he said, well, I guess if he did talk bad about her, he would say things like, she shouldn't treat me that way because I'm the man. I'm the boy. I'm the guy that's man of the house, basically. And that, to me, I thought was interesting and revealing.
Right. Because, like I said, he's just repeating what he's heard. He's just carrying water. He's heard it. It's been said before. And that's what he's saying.
And you were in a unique position at that time to see, you had a front row seat to see what was going on in those weeks and months leading up to Brandon's demise. And really those full 3 years, well, his whole life, but particularly those 3 years, because Sharon at that point was a single mom, struggling financially because Randy wasn't always consistent with helping with his part for child support. He was also not doing as well financially. But you were right there helping with Elizabeth, helping her get ready for school. You even took a job out there close to her house so that you could help in the mornings to get the kids out the door and ready for school, or you could be there to help at night to get them to bed and, ready for the next day.
Yeah, I'm a pharmacist. I passed about 14 different pharmacies going to a store over there in Gulf Breeze so I could be near my sister, like you said, to help with the kids and be right there. When Randy divorced Sharon, he left her with 77 cents in the bank. He took everything. So there's my sister with half the income there, and she's already beaten down, so we didn't want that to happen. So we could help her financially and definitely help her physically. And you've got 2 children. Everybody knows that has more than one child. You can't be at 2 ballparks. You can't be at dance and football. You can't be at whatever else. Biz was doing little girl soccer and big boy soccer. So we had to help. Our family's always done that anyway. But I just would spend the night there sometimes and then get up and go to work if I had a turnaround, especially because pharmacists get off at 10 a lot of times. So put him to bed.
So basically there was a good routine. Brandon was doing well in school, honor roll student. He was actually being scouted by a college for his pitching abilities because he did pretty well as a pitcher. He was a talented baseball player. Biz was doing well in school. Everything seemed to be normal. Sharon also, according to her friends and family, was becoming happier. Her confidence was back. She was feeling good about her life. She was no longer way down in an unhappy marriage with a man who she felt like was not as committed to being a husband and father as she was to being a wife and a mother. So things were looking on the up and up. And then Brandon's behavior, the drug use, which started a couple of years, intensified. His behavior, his personality changed so that by the spring of 2013, friends and family were starting to notice he was had an affect. He was almost dead emotionally, was not responding like he was aggressive, rude with Sharon especially. And you began to suspect that there was more to this drug use than he was letting on, that he was partying more than just an average kid might be throwing down. When did you and Sharon start to notice that perhaps Brandon was into drugs? When did she find out for sure that he was doing that?
Well, I would say it would be in November, when we really, really said something's happening.
But no, she found drugs in his closet, though, before he moved out of his dad.
Oh, yeah. Well, then that's when he started being disrespectful and staying out late and talking back a little bit and just being a little more aggressive.
Right. Not taking out the trash, not being there to help Elizabeth, showing up trashed after a night of partying with grass stains on his shirt. What happened there?
Well, when he came home that time.
That was in the summer of 2013.
Right. Sharon had called me over there and she said, he doesn't remember where he was. I mean, she says, Mom, she's scared to death. And he came home, he had grass stains on the collar and the shoulders and the front of his shirt and all around his neck and up around here, And so they asked him where he had been, and he had been out drinking, and he was hurting. His body was hurting, and he was hurting on his backside too. So I think, and Sharon thinks, that somebody assaulted him. And he cried and cried and cried. And she had told him, she said, I don't want any alcohol in the house. I don't want any drugs in this house. And she told him to get it out of his car. So he said he did. So she, just being a mother, I don't know that I would have done this. Being a mother, she went out and checked the trunk and looked in his backpack. And there were a bunch of those, what are people called, tall boys, those tall drink beer in there. And he had thrown ice in there. I mean, nothing's making sense in a backpack like that.
Right.
So that was the time when she was like, oh no.
Eye-opening. And then she started to look into his things. She started going through his room. And that's when she found those skull cans filled with marijuana, potentially spice. That was still, you could buy that over the counter back then. And that was a terrible drug that, according to psychologists and counselors that I've interviewed that were dealing with that, the impact of that drug at the time, they were seeing youth hospitalized, also sent to mental health facilities after using that because it sprayed with such terrible chemicals that it was actually emulating the signs of schizophrenia, is what one counselor told me. Exactly. That they had to create an entirely new unit to get funded by the state of Florida for a time program in order to handle so many young people that were having these schizophrenic type symptoms, reactions to this drug. So you guys suspected that he was doing spice. Sharon was concerned, of course, about his future, concerned about Elizabeth being exposed to it when she found these drugs. She also found bongs, glass pipes. He didn't deny it. And in fact, he just sort of got huffy and puffy and like, you can't tell me what to do. Yeah. And she was like, I can. This is my house.
Right.
And yet, to hear Randy talk, his father, I read the investigative reports, the statements that he made to investigators after Brandon killed his mother. And Randy Aydelott flat told the investigators that the reason that Brandon had issues with his mom is because she was emotionally abusive. And you don't think that's the case at all. And truthfully, the explanation that Randy gave to investigators to justify why he felt she was emotionally abusive certainly didn't lend itself to explain that. He basically said she would stay on him like she would stay on Brandon like she stayed on him. And that his theory was that once he was out of the house, Sharon stayed on Brandon like she stayed on him. But his examples were just that, like he bought her a ring one time and she didn't like it. And from then on, he had to go take her to see what she wanted to buy. And he felt like that was emotionally abusive. These were not hard-hitting, traumatic examples he was giving. So you don't buy that.
No, and I don't even know that was true about the ring. We've been taught to be polite and gracious. We're Southern women. We know better than that. And he just would tell a lie when the truth will do. And if staying on someone is reminding them the garbage needs to go out today and they can't remember that or this, that, and the other, they are normal things that normal people ask people to do. He just didn't like having to be reminded. I mean, she had to buy him special shoes so he could go outside and take the trash can out when the trash man would be there because he always wanted to lace up his shoes and take forever doing that. She bought him some slides just to go out. Sharon was not emotionally abusive. She was a mother that loved her children. A parent that does not correct their children, that's abusive to me, or lazy or what have you, or not love. She did correct him, and he would go probably whine to his daddy about it because she won't let him at 15, 16 years old run the house. Children don't run the house. The parents do.
And yes. And one thing I think that's important for our audience to know too, is that during that time, and in fact, during that entire 3 years from the time that they split, the divorce was final in 2011. Well, from 2011 on, Randy Aydelott basically personally filed summons after court summons against Sharon to either alter or change child support, alter or change custody of Brandon, not Biz. Yeah. And he was always seemed to be concerned about money. Yeah. It seemed to be so. I'm sure that Brandon coming and complaining to him in his mind too, according to interviews and statements that he made to investigators, he felt like it was in his best interest not to make Brandon mad at him because he wanted custody of Brandon.
He wanted custody of Brandon because Brandon's 17 and something years old. You don't have to pay custody after 18. Biz is 10. And who cares? Then he wanted double what he was paying Sharon. It's just so vulgar looking at all that and how he just kept on and on and on abusing her. And I don't even understand why the people at the courthouse will let somebody just keep filing something, but not before he ran all of Gulf Breeze down and all the institutions and all the people in Gulf Breeze, how horrible they were. But then that's where he wants to bring Biz after Sharon's murdered, So, I mean, he says what he wants to say to get what he wants. And then Brandon was learning that. Like I said, we've heard this before.
Yes. So Brandon moves out of his mother's house in September of 2013, moves in with his father because he's refusing to follow her rules. Again, becoming increasingly belligerent, disrespectful, arrogant. Did his behavior improve at all after the move?
No, it might for a few minutes when he self-admitted to his dad that he would be nice to Sharon a little bit more because if he wanted new contacts or a new Tommy John sleeve because he was a pitcher or if whatever he wanted. Sharon and Biz were sitting in Chick-fil-A right there in Gulf Breeze one day. Brandon walked in. He didn't even speak to either one of them. It broke Sharon's heart. He did that on purpose. I mean, he was learning what his dad did, that manipulation and that pitifulness and that I'll be silent to you. I mean,
playing victim.
Yeah, it's Exactly. Blaming everybody else but yourself. Not culpable, not responsible. The same thing he's having trouble with right now. Accepting responsibility for the murder you did.
Well, and according to court documents, according to interviews with friends and family of Brandon's as well as of Sharon's, his grades started to drop once he moved in with his dad. Even by Randy's account, his life got worse. Now, Randy would make it sound to investigators his life got worse because he did not have the money to give Brandon the lifestyle that he was used to living with his mom, but it's because he lost his job and couldn't replace it with an adequately paying one. Sharon was former teacher of the year, maintained a steady job, and was popular and successful at it as a teacher for 15 years. She shouldn't be blamed for holding down a job and having better money, but Randy, in these statements to investigators, definitely made it sound as if poor Brandon just suffered living with him, but he was doing the best he could because he was trying to protect his son from his emotionally abusive mother.
Sharon never even hardly raised her voice at Brandon. She would send him to his room. She would tell him that was not good what he did. If it was something he did, she would talk to him about it. She'd even call me to come over there to talk to him too.
Right.
You know, because she loved him. She spent her whole life, she almost died trying to have him. You know, so she spent her whole life loving him and taking care of him. If taking care of your child is abusive, then...
Yes, he was diagnosed with failure to thrive in the womb. They recommended that she have an abortion because of her spiritual beliefs, and she decided she did not want to pursue that route. Unfortunately, he came out with some medical problems, but was okay and thrived. He certainly did. Yeah. Like you said, she made the choice to have him, and here he turns around and kills her later. That's like a double whammy. But let's talk a little bit about the string of incidents, because his behavior did continue just to spiral down once he moved in with his dad. There were other signs. His grades dropping off, we mentioned. He lost interest in sports, which was his driving passion since he was a kid. Then in early December, he sends a string of bizarre texts to a girl he liked, which scared the girl. They didn't make any sense. References about take your Jesus stick out of me. And she kept saying, are you high? What's wrong? And he would never answer. Became increasingly violent. His friends talked about how he beamed a freshman player in the face with a ball. You talk about how he was belligerent and ugly at your father's 80th birthday party at the end of November. The family talks about how belligerent he was at Thanksgiving. So 2 weeks before he kills her, y'all have a drug intervention for him because he'd actually sucker punched a kid who he thought was having a relationship, if you will, with the girl that he sent the text to, the girl that he had dated. He felt like the reason this girl didn't want to date him anymore was not because he was acting strange, but because she liked this other kid. So he waits for this kid to get off work one night, sucker punches him in the face. That kid's mother calls Sharon and says, listen, I don't want to ruin Brandon's life, but we don't want to get the law involved, but you've got to get him help. So that's when the family has this intervention. You give him an over-counter drug test. It tests positive for a variety of drugs.
Benzos, marijuana, opioids, the whole bunch. You know, it was, I think, a 12-panel test. And so Randy had asked for the drug test because Brandon was living with him, and he wanted to know if I would give it to him. I said, no, I will not. He's your son. He's living with you, but I will read it. And I read it. I read it with my very own eyes. And then Sharon ends up over there at the intervention. She wasn't even supposed to be there, but she came up by the store where Randy had been earlier. And she said, where are you going? I said, to read a drug test on Brandon. So Brandon, in his mind, perceives it as Sharon was making him take that drug test.
That's right. And then you take him to this facility. They give him 2 drug tests there. He passes them, but the facility admits that they don't test for synthetic drugs, which is what spice is. Sharon wants to keep him in there, but because the drug tests come out clean, her insurance won't cover it. And you offer to pay, her family offers to pay to keep him in there, because whether the drug tests come out clean or not, in her opinion, there was clearly something wrong. I have the texts that were pulled from the investigative record between her and Randy Aydelott, where she's begging him to keep their son in this facility because he needs help. She knows he does. There's something wrong, whether it's drugs or not. And Randy flat tells her, no, we have to take him out. They won't keep him because the insurance insurance won't pay.
Mhm.
And then she said, well, let's keep him in there anyway. My family will pay. And he was like, well, they didn't say we have to take him out, but he's got to play baseball and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
So he took Brandon out. And according to Brandon's friends, he did blame Sharon for sending him to this facility when he, quote unquote, didn't test positive for marijuana. So he never really denied using drugs. It was just this arrogant attitude of, I wasn't caught. How dare her even send me there?
No culpability. They can't take responsibility, him or Randy. They're always trying to get away with something. And everybody's gone too far that calls them out on it.
So 2 weeks later, after this intervention in mid-December, Brandon Aydelott shows up at his mother's doorstep armed with a knife he brought from his father's apartment. This is on Christmas Eve. Police say he stabbed her over and over in the doorway of her own home, stopping only to retrieve more knives when he broke the blades off in her skull on at least 2 of them. He also stopped to get his favorite baseball bat, one that his mother had bought for him, out of his room. He beat her with it. Police say he left her, Sharon Aydelott, in a pool of her own blood, unrecognizable and nearly decapitated. And like we've talked about, he later confessed with a smile and told investigators that he did the right thing. And so in light of what you know about all the circumstances leading up to that, why do you think he felt like he did the right thing?
I feel like he was completing a mission. If the voices in his head told him to do it, I mean, he was a dutiful son. He couldn't find the gun at his daddy's house, so he told me, the sharpest knife in the drawer. So he got it, put it, and I even asked him how. He said he put it up the sleeve of his hoodie, and he drove over there, had to make some decisions driving over to Sharon's house. And he even embellished the story, I think, and said he knocked on the door and grabbed Sharon from behind like OJ, which we find that's not true either. And he said he slit her throat, OJ style. And I just asked him, because it makes me so, I don't even know the word, to know he's the last person that saw my sister, and that's the last thing she saw. I said, what did Sharon say, Brandon? He said, she said, help.
Do you believe he's sorry for killing her?
He's not. He's sorry he got caught. He's sorry he has to be inconvenienced. He's sorry that he's caused trouble for his daddy. He's sorry because even after the murder, Randy knew Brandon did it.
Yeah, he
did. He knew it. He reported that. She's dead. She's dead. He stabbed her in the head.
That's right. He's the one that found her, he and his daughter, and they called 911. And those are details, again, that we get more into in other episodes of this case. But
he's not sorry.
No, he's not sorry. And again, in about 6 months, his case is coming back up for review. State psychologists believe that he will meet the criteria for them to recommend him for conditional release. And you do not feel like that's justice. What does justice look like for Sharon, in your opinion?
He should stay incarcerated, in residence, whatever sweet word they want to use. He is a murderer. He took someone else's life. His rights don't supersede Sharon's. They don't supersede ours. He's already said he will threaten to kill the rest, and not through killing the rest of my family. He's got a hit list. He said he tells people what they want to hear. Justice looks like we allowed for mercy by not making him go to basically prison. And in hindsight, I would never take this route again. In hindsight, and anybody out there in the same situation, never accept not guilty by reason of insanity.
Well, Pam, thank you so much for sharing your experiences about what happened with your sister. I know there's a lot more to discuss, and we'll continue to talk about this and other cases where victims need an advocate, somebody who has seen it, been there, experienced it, and we're going to talk more about those cases as well. You can find more episodes on YouTube and Spotify. And again, there's also much more on the aftermath of Sharon Hill Aydelott's homicide, including how her daughter, her ex-husband, and possibly even her own son have benefited from her death. Listen to my podcast, Gulf Coast Confidential, for those details. And until then, we'll see you next time.